Okay, so this is going to be a relatively short video lecture. We're just going to discuss this idea of utility. And so if you take a look at lesson 5, we're going to look over those first few questions on utility. And then I've also posted an Excel spreadsheet with some examples um, of the budget constraints, which we'll come back to. But in the very first tab of that spreadsheet, I've got a little example demonstrating the difference between total utility and marginal utility. So you recall from our discussion about rational self-interest, we believe that individuals make choices in a way that will benefit themselves in an effort to maximize their utility or their happiness or their satisfaction. So if we look at the spreadsheet, I've got a little example here about cookie consumption. So generally speaking, if I like cookies, then the more cookies I eat, the happier I will be. So let's imagine for a moment that we can plug electrodes in my brain and actually measure the level of happiness I experience as I eat, more and more cookies. So obviously, if I'm eating 0 cookies, I'm going to be getting 0 utility from cookies. So 0 cookies, my total utility is 0. But the minute I eat that first cookie, I'm going to start to feel some satisfaction, some happiness. And so my total utility goes from 0 up to 20 utils, or 20 units of happiness. And as I continue to eat one more cookie, you'll see my overall level of happiness rise. So from 1 cookie to 2 cookies, my total utility rises from 20 to 37 units. So I'm experiencing greater level of happiness by eating more cookies. And so it'll continue in that fashion. I eat more cookies, my total utility increases, but only up to a point. So if you go down and you look in that little table and you see I hit 7 cookies, and at that point I'm experiencing even more utility, 77 units of happiness. But if I eat that 8th cookie, it turns out my overall level of happiness is the same. It doesn't change. I'm still experiencing only 77 units of happiness. And so what that means is that that 8th cookie really didn't make me any better off, but it didn't make me any worse off. But what happens when I eat that 9th cookie? Well, you'll see that my total utility actually starts to fall now from 77 to 74 units of happiness. So something about eating that 9th cookie actually made me worse off. So maybe it's that going from the 8th to the 9th cookie is when I start to feel really full, or maybe I start to feel a little sick because I've eaten all that sugar. And so, generally speaking, more is better, we think, but only up to a point. Because beyond some maximum level of utility, continued consumption of that good, in this case cookies, may actually start to negate or diminish my total utility. So that's what's going on with total utility. Generally speaking, the more you consume, the happier you feel, but eventually total utility may start to fall. Now, obviously, if I were trying to maximize my utility, I would try to eat cookies up until about the 7th or 8th cookie, right? If you look in that total column for total utility, you'll see that the highest level of utility is reached at 7 or 8 cookies. But remember, in economics, we believe that people make decisions not all or nothing, right? So I'm not going to decide to eat, 8 cookies or 0 cookies. I'm going to start at 0 and, eat each additional cookie, 1 cookie at a time. So what we do is we take that information that we gain from plugging the wires into my brain and measure my total utility, and then we want to know what we want to know is how much additional utility did I get from eating each additional cookie. So from going from 0 to 1 cookies, right? My total utility went from 0 to 20. So the marginal utility of that first cookie is just 20 utils. As I go from 1 cookie to 2 cookies, my total utility rises, right? So I'm experiencing a higher overall level of happiness, but the marginal utility of that second cookie was only 17 utils. So it still increased my total utility, but it didn't give me as much utility as that first cookie did. And so what we see as we consume additional cookies, total utility continues to rise up to a point, but the marginal utility is following. Every time I eat one more cookie, my total utility goes up, but not quite as much as it did with the previous cookie. And so then we get down to those 7th and 8th cookies, and remember, the total utility didn't change as I ate that 8th cookie. It didn't make me any better or worse off. And so the marginal utility of the 8th cookie is 0. I didn't gain utils, I didn't lose any utils. It's not until that 9th cookie where my total utility starts to actually fall, and in that case my marginal utility becomes negative. Because if I go from 8 cookies to 9 cookies, I go from 77 to 74 units of happiness. That represents a decrease in my total utility. So I have -3 marginal utility for that ninth cookie. And so if you look at the chart that's next to that table, you'll see what it looks like. Total utility rises as we begin to eat more cookies up to a point, and then it begins to fall. But marginal utility, right, from the very first cookie, we get a big boost to our utility, but from there on out, it's all downhill. And so it turns out that when we are trying to maximize our utility and figure out how much of a good or service someone will consume, that total utility is useful, but because we make decisions, kind of one step at a time, it's actually going to be much more useful to look at marginal utility. And so what we say is happening, this is getting back to the study guide, the law of diminishing marginal utility. This simply tells us that as we consume more of a good or service, the marginal utility that we gain from each additional unit is going to begin falling. And this is actually one reason why we see that downward sloping demand curve. Because you think about it, if you look at my utils that I'm experiencing from the cookies, well, if I'm getting 20 utils of happiness from the first cookie, my willingness to pay for that cookie is going to be relatively high. The second cookie, right, increases my total utility, but it only gives me 17 utils by itself. And so I might not be quite as willing to pay as much for the second cookie as for the first cookie. And it's going to continue in that fashion. As I eat each additional cookie, the marginal utility gained diminishes, which translates into a lower willingness to pay. I'm not benefiting as much from each cookie, and so it's not going to be worth it for me to pay as much for each additional cookie. So that covers the discussion on utility. And if you're following along in the study guide, the next step is to figure out the budget constraint. So remember, individuals are trying to maximize their utility, but we face scarcity. And so we're going to see how a budget constraint can help to illustrate that scarcity. And so I'll post a document that walks through an example of that. And then we'll come back and there will be another short video talking about the last couple of questions in that study guide.